this is part 2 of our section on Chinese religion. This is on Confucianism. I have a quote here from Confucius. It says, "To study and not think is a waste. To think and not study is dangerous." I like the quote because I think it brings us back to our first week and why we should study religion. Because to think about religion without studying it, which is to say to form opinions about it without understanding it, is very dangerous. As Confucius would say that the same goes for anything else, politics, the economy, anything else in the world. To think and not study is dangerous. So I'm sure you've heard of Confucius many times, and I'm sure you've heard that he has a lot of sayings, and he did. If you ever read the works of Confucius, the Analects of Confucius, it is just a series of sayings recorded by his students as they remembered him later on after he died. And he was known for being very brilliant, but also for being very warm and compassionate as a teacher. So our goals for this lecture are to learn about the life of Confucius, his model for an ideal society, and how that relates to Taoism and just Chinese philosophy in general. Study how Confucianism has changed over the millennia. As we look at the way Confucianism has changed, we're also going to look at the way, really what we're going to be looking at is the way Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism have interacted over the years, and why that means that they've all affected each other. They've all changed. So, if we go back to our timeline, see Confucius lived about 551 to 479 BCE. We know his birthday. The Chinese celebrate his birthday every year, even today. We're going to look at Mengzi and Shunzi, two of his more famous students who came about 8 years after he died. And then we're going to look at Jushi and Neo-Confucianism, which came about in the Song Dynasty. So you'll notice there's kind of a big gap here where not a lot was happening in Confucian thought. We think about what was going on here, right? Confucius came about, there's Confucianism. And then what do we see here? We see the development of Taoism, right? Taoism was developing these ideas about immortality and heavenly masters, which became a very important part of Taoism. So Taoism was developing quite a bit. Then Buddhism was coming in, right? Buddhism came in right in this big gap right here. And Buddhism brought its own ethical framework with it, right? Buddhism definitely has a set of ethics about the way we should treat the world and form the Eightfold Path. Previously, the philosophical construct that informed China's ethics was Confucianism. Confucianism was Chinese ethics. Taoism was Chinese religion. And the two kind of went hand in hand. And Buddhism came in, and it kind of threw off the balance. What we see is around the Song Dynasty, right in here, Jushi and some other thinkers came along, and they tried to repress the Buddhist movement, which had become very large. They tried to repress the Zen Buddhist movement, right? And they created what was later called Neo-Confucianism, New Confucianism, and reestablished it as the Chinese model for society. So Confucianism is often called the practice of virtue, right? There's a big question about whether or not Confucianism is a religion or just a philosophy. When I took Chinese history in college, we had to write a paper on it, and it'll be the subject of today's discussion as well. Is it philosophy or is it religion? It originated about the same time as Taoism, but it is not based upon the unseen reality. Confucianism acknowledges the unseen reality, right? It accepts the unseen reality, and Confucianism encourages people to practice religion. Confucianism thinks religion is a very important part of an orderly society. It encourages giving offerings to your ancestors, right? And we saw in the last lecture. Religion is very much a part of Confucianism, but Confucianism doesn't in any way try to teach what religion is, or how to practice it, or what the unseen reality is. It just says that that's a good thing. That's a good thing that good people do, right? Because Confucianism, unlike Taoism, Confucianism is interested in good and evil and how to be a good person. So you see there's this important balance between Taoism and Confucianism. It's kind of like the yin and the yang, right? It's not that one is better and one is worse. It's that they're complementary. Taoism is interested in the unseen reality, and Confucianism is interested in being a good person and ethics. His teachings, Confuci, is his Chinese name, Confuci. You can see where we get Confucius from, Confuci. His teachings are called Rujiao, which means the teaching of the scholars. And in Chinese literature, you'll often see the phrase, the teacher said, and they're quoting Confucius. He is the teacher. He is the great teacher. And he is this teaching of the scholars, his philosophy, became not only a model for virtuous living, but a model for education, a model for learning, as we will see. So his philosophy was based on ancient Chinese beliefs, the mandate of heaven, right? We talk about the mandate of heaven and how if you're a good, virtuous ruler, then your kingdom will thrive. If you're an evil ruler, then you'll lose the mandate of heaven and your kingdom will not do very well. Ancestor worship, spirits, and the power of ritual, called Li, right? So when we talk about ritual, we're not just talking about religious ritual. Confucius was interested in all rituals, the rituals of propriety, the rituals of just being a good person. That when you talk, for example, if you're a child and you're talking to your elder, then you would place your hands nicely in front of you and keep your head bowed in to show your humility to your elder. You wouldn't look your elder in the eyes. That's not what you do in China, right? In the West, you always make eye contact. In China, you don't make eye contact with your elders, traditionally, right? So that's a ritual. The ritual of, treating your children a certain manner. In the West, we shake hands when we meet. That's a sort of ritual. That's a sort of ritual that Confucius was interested in. He was very much interested in a society that was ordered by hierarchy, by knowing who was your better and who was beneath you, and knowing how to treat those people correctly and virtuously, and knowing the rituals to show that. The rituals were very, very important in Confucianism. And the goal of Confucianism was to develop a just and orderly society. So Master Kong kind of had a difficult early life, and that informed kind of who he became. His father died when he was 3. His mother died when he was 23. And he didn't have a lot of money. He was from a high enough class that he was able to study the ancient ceremonial rites. Again, these Li that we've talked about. He studied the 6 classics of China's cultural heritage, the I Ching. Remember, the I Ching is the yin and the yang, right? The way the yin and the yang inform the universe. Poetry, history, rituals, music, and dance. So this was what ancient Chinese education looked like with these 6 classics. And the time that he lived in, as I mentioned in the last lecture, the time that he lived in was a time of a great deal of political turmoil. Okay? There was a lot of corruption, there was a lot of warring and battling, and Master Kong was very disillusioned by it, right? He had had a difficult childhood, clearly. But he found a lot of solace. He found a great deal of wisdom and comfort in studying in his studies. And he eventually became a teacher, and he taught the 6 classics, and he also taught his own interpretations of the 6 classics and of society, what these things have to say about society. He was particularly fond of music. He wrote a lot about music, and he even said to his students that he felt that if you had a person who was very base, someone who didn't have a lot of culture, who was very rude and disrespectful, that you should teach them music, because through learning music you can you just naturally cultivate a sense of culture and a better self. Right? He loved music, and he also believed very strongly in studying rituals. Again, not just religious rituals, but social rituals between people, which are very, very important in Asia, even until today. His teaching was recognized only in the centuries after his death, so even in his own life, he wasn't very famous. We'll talk about Mencius and Xunzi, and how, in a lot of ways, they were his later students he didn't even meet, but students in the sense that they studied his writings and his teachings. They were more recognized in their time than Confucius was recognized in his time. But eventually, Confucius's writings and studies and philosophy became the basis for education in China. And China is really quite famous for its education system. It had a national examination system going all the way back before any other civilization did on Earth. Right? He believed that rulers should be educated, and that there should be some sort of standard for anyone to govern. And so China developed this exam system where if you wanted to be a ruler, if you wanted to be a governor, if you wanted to rule a city, you had to pass an exam. The exam was on the 6 classics and on Confucius's writings. The emperor, of course, didn't have to pass that exam, but pretty much everyone else underneath him did. So he was a really important figure in Asian history, in Chinese history. So Confucian virtues include the idea of Ren, which literally means like humanity. It's innate goodness, it's love and benevolence and humaneness and human-heartedness, right? Confucianism is often portrayed as being kind of cold and strict and a series of like rules and a series of customs that you need to follow when you deal with other people. But Confucius believed that underneath all of these rules and standards, there should be innate goodness. There should be humanity underneath it, and it should come from a place of loving other people. He believed that strong government required rulers who lead virtuous lives, set a good example. Right? These gentlemen scholars I mentioned, you have to be learned, and you have to pass exams to become a ruler. And this also goes back to the mandate of heaven, right? In Taoism, there's this idea that heaven would bless your rule, would bless your life if you were virtuous. So Confucius takes that idea and he kind of develops it into secular society, and we call this reciprocal hierarchy. Hierarchy means like a system of levels of class, right? There are certain people who are above you. The emperor is at the top of the totem pole, and then there are princes, and there are kind of lower rulers like governors and things, and then there are scholars, and there are merchants, and there are peasants at the bottom. This sort of pyramid scheme. It's a hierarchy that Confucius taught, and he believed that there was a reciprocity in it. Reciprocity as in giving back and forth. Reciprocity as in giving back and forth, right? It wasn't just about the people on the bottom serving the people on the top. The people on the top had to serve the people on the bottom too, right? There had to be reciprocity in order for there to be order in society. He emphasized relationships over individuality. The relationships between a parent and child, between older and younger siblings, husbands and wives, older and younger friends, rulers and subjects. Again, it's part of his hierarchy. And the name of this sort of relationship is filial piety. Filial piety means showing respect for people above you, for people in a higher station. And that was the model trait in proper relationships. Filial piety is so important even today in Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and East Asian society. Showing respect for your elders is very important. And that's why even though in these sorts of traditions it might seem like people have a lot of choice in terms of like the gods that they want to worship, and the sects that they might want to choose, the practices they might want to choose within their own religions. But really they don't, because of this part, right? It might be that your religion doesn't tell you exactly how to worship, but your family will. Your family and your community will. And you'll follow that, because that's the proper way to be, right? That's the proper way to act, to be a virtuous person. A virtuous person respects the people above them and takes care of the people below them. And passing on these sorts of traditions and rituals and ideas is kind of is where a lot of the ethics and the rules of Asian life come from. Not from the church, from your family. And so there's not really a lot of individualism in Asia, right? There's not a great amount of emphasis put on it, but they would say that what they have is a sense of place and a sense of purpose in their lives, right? They don't get to choose necessarily, but they have a sense of security. They know exactly who they are in their lives. This is the Confucian model of society, the reciprocal hierarchy, right? Like I say, it's like a pyramid. At the top, you have, in society, in secular society, at the top you have the emperor, and at the bottom you have society, peasants, everyone else. The higher you go, the fewer people there are. This model is comparable, or is the same in religion, right? So at the top you have ancestral spirits, you have heaven. At the bottom you have, the living, the people who need to respect the people up here. It's the same way in a family, right? Up here you have the head of the family, who's going to be the father, the patriarch likely, and to some extent the mother as well. And then you have, then it goes down according to age, right? At the bottom you have like the children, the youngest children, and then you need to respect the people who are older than them. And those people need to respect the people older than them, and so on and so forth. Right? So this is what an orderly society looks like. Everyone has a place, you know your place, you take care of the people below you, that's very important, and then you respect the people above you. Confucius railed against rulers who did not take care of the people they were in charge of. He railed against that sort of corruption. That sort of corruption is what made his time, the time that he lived, so difficult, why there's so much political turmoil and so many wars. Because he believed the rulers were more interested in gaining power for themselves than taking care of the people below them. In his writings, he talks a lot about the, gentleman scholars, about the way a ruler should be. He talks more about that in some ways than he does in the people, in instructions for the people at the bottom of the totem pole, the bottom of the pyramid. So this is what society should look like. And it's not like in Buddhism and Hinduism where it's about getting out of the cycle. It's about knowing your place in it. Right? Like in Taoism, you need to understand the laws that rule this pyramid, and you need to know how to move with it, how to flow with it, not how to break out of it. So as I mentioned, Mengzi and Shunzi were followers of Confucius, though they didn't meet him. They were born after his death. And they kind of had two different ways of interpreting Confucius's studies, or his philosophy. Mencius, or Mengzi, was an optimist, and he believed that people were good by nature. He believed in righteous conduct, which is called yi, and he believed that that the rules Confucius put forward about the way to act were things that came natural to people, whereas Sun Tzu was kind of the pessimist, and he believed that humans were self-centered by nature, and that there are these natural laws that heaven puts forth, but that people won't follow the natural laws. People won't act well, won't be good unless they're forced to, unless strict guidelines are put forward for them to follow. Now, Mencius and Sun Tzu were contemporaries. They were studying and writing at the same time, and in a lot of ways, Mencius is kind of more loved for obvious reasons, but Sun Tzu was kind of taken more seriously by rulers, right? China has a history of very strict rule by emperors, and a lot of rulers looked back to Sun Tzu. This idea that rulers needed to set strict laws for people, strict punishments, in order for them to be good. So Confucianism was finally adopted by the state. It had become very popular and adopted by the state in the Han Dynasty, which was a very famous dynasty. It's another story. 205 to 220 CE is when it, 220 CE, it's 400 years is when Confucianism became the state cult. By cult, I mean, the culture, the proper way of acting. The state cult is the government, the government. It's the system of philosophy or religion upheld by the government, right? And traditionally, most countries had a state cult. And in China, it was Confucianism. Not even Taoism, though, certainly people were practicing it. But Confucianism was what was pushed, right? And that was several hundred years after Confucius had died. So there's a question historians ask about whether or not, people were really interested at that time in becoming civil and making a better society, or whether it was just a veneer, whether it was just corrupt leaders trying to make themselves look less corrupt. But whatever it was, it did become the state cult, and people seeking government positions. That's when the exam system was put forth, was put in place, and so it was a very important time. It was right before Buddhism came into China. So Buddhism came in, skip ahead about 700 years, and Confucianism was in a decline. Okay, that was the Song Dynasty by that point. Confucianism was in a decline, and there were several writers and thinkers who thought that Confucianism needed to come back. And it was really based in kind of a sort of nationalism, that kind of pride in being Chinese, right? Most countries and cultures will encounter the outside world, will encounter other cultures, and then they will have an internal reaction where they try to remind themselves of who they are, and they start to react in fear to the concept of foreign invasion, not invasion as much as foreign, having trouble thinking of words, foreign influence, right? We see it in America. We see it in Europe. The idea of immigrants coming in and changing things, right? That sort of, that nationalistic, that patriotism. It creates a desire to reestablish what is really American, or what is really French or English or anything. What is really Chinese. That's what the Chinese were going through at the time. Desire to reestablish what it was to be Chinese. And Buddhism was a foreign religion, and it brought in foreign ideas. And so you see this resurgence of Confucianism. And part of it was premised on the idea that Buddhism and Taoism had brought about moral and political weakness into Chinese society. Keep in mind, the dynasty previous to the Song was the Tang Dynasty, which is one of the most famous dynasties in Chinese history. It was a time of great political power and economic prosperity and influence. During the Song Dynasty, things were kind of on a decline, right? So there's this idea, there's this desire to place blame on the reason why the economy and the culture was on the decline. And it was blamed on Buddhism and to a lesser extent Taoism. And so there's a resurgence of Confucianism as the proper model of Chinese virtue. Filial piety gained a sort of metaphysical side where you're not only supposed to be pious towards your elders, but also pious towards ancestors and towards gods and things like that. Meditation became important to the noble person. Which is interesting because even though they're trying to repress certain Buddhist ideas, meditation had become kind of a Chinese thing, right? It was kind of forgotten that was a Buddhist influence. And Neo-Confucianism encouraged women to offer themselves in total sacrifice to others. This is significant because, again, during the Tang Dynasty, Chinese women had kind of experienced a greater amount of freedom and power than they had ever experienced in Chinese history. So now you see kind of the pressure being put back on them to be good women and to stay at home and that sort of thing. Let's see here. So I have another book here on Chinese philosophy. You can see that. I'm going to read just a section of it to you. This is the writings of Jushi, who is a famous Neo-Confucius philosopher. And he talks about why Taoism is better than Buddhism. Okay? This is kind of interesting. Let's see here. The mistake of the Buddhists arises from their dislike of the world, which is a result of their selfishness. The mistake of the Taoists arises from their trickery, which is a result of their selfishness. But the mistake of the Buddhists is to dislike and take lightly human affairs, and therefore wish completely to turn everything into a void. Right? So the Buddhist problem is they don't take human issues, they don't take humanity seriously, and they want to think that everything is nothingness, everything is a void. The mistakes of the Taoists is to take advantage of critical situations and opportunities to resort to tricks and expediency. So he wasn't really too fond of Taoism either, but he comes back and he says, it is not necessary to examine the doctrines of Buddhism and Taoism deeply to understand them. The mere fact that they discard the three bonds between ruler and minister, father and son, husband and wife, right? These are Confucian ideas about relationships. And the five constant virtues, righteousness, deep love, friendliness, respect, and filial piety, is a crime of the greatest magnitude. Nothing more need be said about the rest. Right? So, and then he goes on and he talks about how the Buddhist concept of emptiness is kind of useless, and it leads people to not care about each other. And he references Zen Buddhism quite often because this was a period of time when Chan or Zen Buddhism was really popular in China. So there was this reversal, right? Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism kind of all ebbed and flowed at different times, and this was a time when Confucianism flowed again and became very powerful, and Buddhism and Taoism were kind of on the decline. And this is important because some of these ideas, especially the repression of women and the importance of meditation, becoming a noble person, the metaphysical side of filial piety, these things remained in Confucianism. They remained in Chinese society for the next several centuries, even up until today. Fast forward again another 700 years and look at communism. We know, of course, from last week the communist regime in China has put a great deal of pressure on Tibetan Buddhists. Confucianism has as well been attacked by communists. The Cultural Revolution, which was a communist movement, attacked the four old things: old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits, and tried to create a new China. And part of that was Confucianism, trying to do away with Confucianism as supporting the old imperial system, whereas the communists wanted to create a new, more democratic system. However, recently, communist leaders in China have kind of begun to advocate for a more Confucian society again. They talk about order in society and importance of creating scholars to rule. So really, you can't take Confucianism out of China. Even if you put a communist, anti-religious regime in control of China, you can't take communism out, or you can't take Confucianism out. Confucianism is very much a part of the Chinese ideal, right? The communists want order in society just as much as Confucius did. It's part of the Chinese perspective, the Chinese worldview. Confucianism is not officially recognized as a religion in China, but as I say, the Confucian morality forms the basis of Chinese ethics. You can't take it out. You can't take it out. There's just no way. This is a Confucian wedding. It was held in Taiwan. I believe these pictures were taken about 5 years ago. And this is at a Confucius temple. There are Confucian temples that are there basically to honor Confucius. They're places of ancestor worship, right? You go there to honor Confucius the same way you would honor one of your ancestors. He's kind of like the great ancestor of everybody, right? He's like the common ancestor of everybody. Everyone gives offerings to him as they would their own family members. So this couple, this man here is Taiwanese, his wife is Japanese, I believe, and they met at a university, and they decided that they wanted to have a traditional Confucian wedding. So they went to this large Confucian temple where they had not performed a traditional Confucian wedding in decades. No one had even asked. It's not something that anyone does anymore. But I thought it was pretty interesting that people are gaining an interest in Confucianism again. You can see they have dancers. Dancing is an important part of Confucian ritual. And these long feathers, and they have the scrolls, and they wear yellow, which is the color of the scholars, right? That was pretty neat. Here, again, is a Confucian temple. It looks very much like any other Chinese temple. And you can see this is on a day that is near exam day in China. Or I'm sorry, I think this picture was taken in Taiwan again. It might have been taken in China. But you can see people, that these temples are most populated, or they're most used by students and by the parents of students who want their children to do well in school. And even till today, they still have an exam system in China and in Taiwan and in Japan and in Korea. If you want to go to college, there's an national exam you have to pass, similar to the SATs, except when you apply to a college in America, you have your SATs, you write an essay, there are a lot of different parts to your application. In Asia, there's just the exam. The exam is everything. It's a Confucian thing. It's very much a Confucian thing. So close to exams, close to National Exams Day in spring, you can see all the people who come in making offerings to Confucius, hoping that they'll do well. Here is, again, the kind of ritual or dance they would do on Confucius's birthday, especially. And I'm going to post some videos of Confucius's birthday this week. You can see the way they celebrate it. It's pretty interesting. So Confucianism is not confined to China. It has had a huge influence on the rest of Asia as well. in Singapore recently. Singapore, which is a very small but very rich country in Southeast Asia, it has a large Chinese population. They recently had a courtesy campaign that the government put on to get people to be kinder to each other. Again, this idea of these rituals, the li, courtesy, is an important part of Confucianism. In Korea, there are a lot of Confucian teachings of civility and modesty and propriety without so much the Confucian identity, right? I think a lot of Koreans wouldn't identify as Confucian, yet these ideas have kind of seeped in to Korea over the years. Japan definitely at one point really embraced Confucianism. And even today, Confucian ideals in constitution, bureaucracy, and the national exam system are still very much in place there. There's a lot of Confucianism kind of in the Zen tradition, despite the fact that Neo-Confucianism kind of railed against Zen Buddhism. The fact of the matter is that there's a lot of Confucian ideals there. The idea of knowing your place, the idea of learning the classics of music and art. All those sorts of things did find their way into the Zen tradition. Moral basis for relationships is also an important part of Japanese society. And the virtues of diligence, education, moral self-cultivation, frugality, and loyalty. All very important in Japan and have a source in Confucianism. So here are a couple more pictures. This is a statue of Confucius. It's in Indonesia, which is way Southeast Asia, way Southeast Asia. You're almost in Australia at that point. And yet Confucianism has had impact there. This is a Chinese New Year festival. There are some Chinese people who live in Indonesia. And they're doing the lion dance right in front of You know what? I'm sorry. It's not Chinese New Year. That's actually Confucius's birthday. They're celebrating Confucius's birthday. Like I say, they do have a celebration every year, and they're doing a lion dance for Confucius's birthday. Here you can just see some people visiting Confucius Temple. It looks very similar to like a Buddhist or a Taoist temple. You just come in, put your hands together, you burn some incense, you might give some money, and you ask for a blessing. I love this picture. Look at this kid. He does not want to be reading that. This is in China. As I mentioned, for a long time, the Chinese government tried to repress Confucianism, the ideals of Confucianism, but it never went away. And now you see there are some new schools in China. They're like after-school programs where kids can go and study Confucianism. And they put them in little traditional Confucian outfits. And this kid clearly just wants to go home. It's an after-school program. He just wants to go home and play video games. But you can see there are girls there as well. And that's become kind of popular in China now. It's kind of become a little fad for parents to put their kids into these Confucian after-school programs. This is Korea. You can tell Koreans have very distinctive garb. And they're doing a special coming-of-age ceremony for, on the other side, they're probably men sitting. This is a picture of the women, and they're in their traditional dress, and they're sipping either tea or sake, I'm not sure which. But again, this comes from a Confucian tradition of, recognizing your coming of age. Now you're older, now you have more responsibilities in society, right? It's about recognizing your place in society and knowing what your responsibilities are to other people. The most important things about Taoism and Confucianism, it's not about yourself, your individualism, your identity. It's not about that. It's about your relationships with your family, your relationships with society, and knowing the proper way to act so that the whole can benefit. It's not about you benefiting. It's not about your spirit benefiting. It's about the whole working together in a way that is orderly, harmonious. With that, I'm going to end this lecture. The question for today, in your opinion, is Confucianism a religion or just a philosophy? There's no right answer. People argue both ways, but I think it's a fascinating question. And I think it's important to push the limits of what we call religion, especially in a world religions class. It's important to push the limits of the impacts of spirituality and philosophy on society. So, is it religion or philosophy? Next lecture, we'll talk a little bit more about the way Taoism and Confucianism kind of intertwine, kind of the gray areas between them. And I think you'll really enjoy that.